ខ្ញុំបាទហាសានសូមស្វាគមន៍ពីរដ្ឋធានី Washington សហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកនៅក្នុង studio សារព័ត៌មាន Cambodia Daily នៅពេលនេះគឺមានលោកមេធាវី Mark Morstein លោកជាមេធាវីដែលធ្លាប់បានចូលរួមនៅក្នុងការដាក់ពាក្យបណ្ដឹងទៅក្រុមហ៊ុនប្រទេសអង់គ្លេសដែលទិញស្ករនាំស្ករពីប្រទេសកម្ពុជាដែលគេហៅថាស្ករឈាមបាទដោយសារថាមានការប្រើពលកម្មកុមារនៅក្នុងចំការអំពៅខេត្តកោះកុងនិងខេត្តកំពង់ស្ពឺបាទលោកជាមេធាវីអន្តរជាតិនៅក្នុងក្រុមហ៊ុនមេធាវីមួយក្នុងរដ្ឋ Virginia ឈ្មោះថា Office Khmer នៅសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកបាទលោកនឹងចូលរួមពិភាក្សាថាតើការយាយីផ្នែកនយោបាយមកលើក្រុមបកប្រឆាំងផ្ទុយនឹងគោលការណ៍អន្តរជាតិយ៉ាងណាខ្លះបាទដោយសារកម្មវិធីនេះយើងមិនបានបកស្រាយបកប្រែជាភាសាខ្មែរយើងសូមជជែកជាមួយលោកមេធាវី Mark Morstein ជាភាសាអង់គ្លេសដូចគ្រាមុនHere with us in the studio today we have our distinguished guest attorney Mark Morstein he was here before and we'd like to welcome you again.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
Nice to have you here today. For our listeners and viewers, today we have in our studio the U.S. legal expert Mark Morstein, who specializes in land use law. He led a campaign to help the Khmer victims of land eviction in sugar plantation in Cambodia's southwestern provinces of Kah Kong and Kampong Speu by suing a British sugar importer, Tate and Lyle, am I correct on
Correct.
that? Yeah, in the British High Court in 2012 and 2013.
Correct.
Thank you. Attorney Mark Morstein, can you help us understand from an international law perspective whether the crackdowns, intimidation, politically motivated charges and arbitrary arrest of opposition party members and activists in whole or in part against international principle and treaties on human, civil and political rights of Cambodian citizens?
It's a big question, but I think the answer is well, there's not a simple answer, but let me, if you bear with me for just a minute.
No problem.
I can go through it.
You have all your time.
After World War II, there was what was known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was really developed by the United Nations in 1948. Those provisions became sort of the bedrock of human rights law following World War II, and have been extremely important in terms of the development of human rights. What was contained in those universal rights were some of the basic concepts of free speech, the right to property, the right to assembly, the right to political parties, things of that nature. In 1993, as you well know, after the Paris Peace Agreement, Cambodia met to essentially draft a new constitution. And there were provisions in that constitution that were essential to the freedoms of individuals in Cambodia. Those had to do with the right of political parties, the right of free speech, the right to own property, the right. There are a number of them. Those rights are not simply aspirational in the sense that this would be something in the future that would allow the Cambodian people. Those rights were essentially guaranteed by a number of countries, the United States being one of them, that those rights would come into play immediately. Because of the disaster of World War II, the disasters of authoritarian governments, the idea was that communism versus capitalism was essentially an obsolete concept. The real development was there authoritarian governments versus democratic governments.
Sure. Yeah.
So what's happened really is that the move toward democracy was essential in Cambodia. So the short answer is anything that would impair the rights of individuals to participate in those rights is an offense not just against the people who are entitled to those, but really the rights in the international community and in Cambodia.
Thank you. The Phnom Penh government led by Prime Minister Hun Sen and his Cambodian People's Party has defied the international community when it calls for the former Communist Party to respect human rights. But the international community for decades has done no more than just verbal condemnation of its gross violation. What does it take for the world to come together and take concrete action to punish the authoritarian regime?
Well, you know, there was an interesting observation that was made by Samantha Powers. I just in the last week I saw she's coming out with a new book. Yeah. But essentially,
she was Obama's White House.
She was Obama's
staff.
Correct. She was the UN representative for the United States.
Okay.
But one of her points is that there has been a decline in democratic growth and there's been an increase of authoritarian growth. And I think what that seems to indicate is that there is a huge part of the world now that doesn't respect democratic principles.
Sure.
So the idea that there is a world policeman that would step in and enforce the law is something of a dream. In Cambodia, for example, again, as I just mentioned, during the 1993 the rise of the PPA and Paris Peace Agreement and the creation of the Constitution, there was a promise by various countries to step in to guarantee democratic principles.
Sure.
I think you may know that approximately 10 years ago, I was involved, or you may know that we drafted a letter requesting the intervention of foreign countries to ensure that democratic principles in Cambodia would be met. We got no responses on that whatsoever, not a single response. So I think the question is most countries recognize that there is something wrong with Cambodia right now in terms of democratic principles. But until there is an international incident that really highlights that, I doubt that anything will happen.
Okay. This leads me to the next question. You wrote a letter, and the PPA was adopted before the UN-sponsored national election. Nearly 30 years have passed since Cambodia held a first free nationwide election under the UN supervision in 1993. Subsequent national elections were contested by the opposition as neither free nor fair. The Western governments expressed disappointment, but then do business as usual. Is this approach effective to promote change or to guarantee democracy or even human rights in Cambodia?
Personally, I don't believe it does. I mean, it's really flies in the face of the rule of law. The theory of law is that you have laws and you have to have the enforcement of laws.
Right.
Laws without enforcement are toothless. And the problem is, where is the enforcement to come? Now, typically the UN can enforce the laws, but the recognition or the recognition should come by the countries themselves. But it's a little bit like asking the fox to guard the hen house.
Okay.
You need somebody from the outside to constantly monitor those countries. The question is always checks and balances. Yeah. Theoretically, in the United States, we have checks and balances, although I'm not sure that's been working out so well lately under the Trump administration.
The past 2 years,
But the idea is that nobody is above the law, and as a result of that, everybody has to be held to account.
Yeah.
When you take away those checks and balances and you lose the enforcement, you lose the laws as well.
Okay. Now, the world invested billions of dollars to help promote peace and democracy, guaranteeing human rights and freedom and the rule of law to the Cambodian citizens. Now, Cambodia has reversed course from democratization to authoritarianism, dissolving the main opposition party, the CNRP, the Cambodian National Rescue Party. In your view, do you think the world made a mistake to trust Hun Sen and let him in power this long?
I think it's a mistake for any person to be in power. It's sort of like anywhere. You know, it's like putting food on a shelf and leaving it there for too long. You know, after a while, it needs to be replaced. The issue with regard to there's the old adage that absolute power corrupts. I mean, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. You cannot leave a person in for a period of time. This has become very much a feudalistic system. It's gone from democracy to authoritarianism to the idea that the only people that can serve in government are those who have feudal loyalty to one leader. Yeah. And as a result of that, you get inefficiencies, and not only inefficiencies, but you get essentially the same type of structure that feudalism promoted. It works up to a point, but it's not going to advance very far. And I think the Cambodian people understand that.
Right. But again, he's there. He's in power. He doesn't seem to show his intention to step down anytime soon. The EU has now used the EBA, Everything But Arms, a tax-free import scheme to punish Hun Sen. The U.S. Congress has introduced a number of resolutions and acts aimed to penalize the regime, including withdrawing, a threat to withdraw the Generalized Systems of Preference, GSP. These punitive measures have pushed the Hun Sen government closer and closer to China, securing more economic aid and interest-free or low-interest loans. Because of the generous aid from China, Hun Sen is now willing to let Beijing turn the Cambodian maritime naval base into dual use. The West is alarmed and viewed it as a threat to shipping security. But what can Washington and its allies do to alter this move by Beijing?
Well, I think anytime any country allies with only one other country as a protectorate, there is always a long-term risk of that, because essentially what Hun Sen has done is put all of his eggs in one basket.
Right.
And the question then becomes is what type of autonomy does Cambodia have if in fact China decides not to reward Cambodia? What if China decides that it has a particular policy and it looks for an ally and it decides to bring Cambodia into a position that basically Cambodians don't want to support? The problem is in terms of development for the Cambodian people, because they're putting all their eggs in one basket with China, essentially economic development is dependent on the Chinese system of development. And the Chinese system, while it works well up to a point, is still essentially a socialist communist approach that needs to develop in terms of full democracy and full business and probably capitalism in terms of promoting the well-being of the poor. We'll see what happens. But I think on the short term, it may work. But I think it's a question of selling your soul to the devil.
But what do you think? What does it take to reverse the course?
Well, I think looking at it from more of a geopolitical point of view, obviously Cambodia wants support. It needs support for its economic development. It cannot sell its goods on the open market because it's not competitive right now. So it needs EBA and it needs the preferences and so forth in order to sell its goods. To the extent that that Europe has withdrawn those trade preferences and the United States has done that, it has the effect of, in essence, of creating sanctions on Cambodia. And what it has the effect of doing, it does two things. One is in the short term, it makes Cambodia poorer, but it forces Hun Sen to recognize that the policies are not productive. Two, it also throws Hun Sen, unfortunately, into the arms of the Chinese even deeper and become more dependent in terms of them. And so it does play into the Chinese. What I think has to happen is that I think the United States has to have an intelligent, logical approach to dealing with Hun Sen and to encourage the development of a viable political and economic system that promotes competition and promotes the ability of electing people other than Hun Sen to positions of leadership.
Does the United States need any sort of incentive to act, perhaps to help?
The United States is
pro-democracy activists.
Unfortunately, the United States right now is very much like any other entity where you have rewards and punishment. The United States, in my opinion, has been very slow to act on Cambodia because, in a sense, Cambodia never threw tantrums. A lot of countries have thrown tantrums. For example, North Korea has, and as a result of that, you got a response. Iran has done that, so you get a response. Cambodia hasn't done it. It's been relatively quiet, and as a result of that, it's been a question of letting sleeping dogs lie. At some point, Cambodians themselves have to make noise, have to show that in fact they are resisting in some way the government of Hun Sen.
They really need real change rather than just keep talking and demonstrating on the streets. Okay. This two questions here, or one or two questions here from our listeners and viewers.
All right.
For you, can the international community intervene if Hun Sen uses armed forces to crush protesters in the street if the CNRP acting president, Mr. Samleng, returns to Cambodia on 9/11? On the 11th, on November 9th.
Well, first of all, the question, I think it's a very fair question. It's a very good question in terms of the issues. There, in the United States history, I want to parallel that to the United States history for a second. Essentially, there was a revolutionary named Thomas Paine, who advocated for revolution. And his counterpart in England was a guy named Edmund Burke. Yeah. And there was always a conflict between the idea of institutional change versus revolutionary change. In other words, evolutionary change versus revolutionary change. Yeah. Essentially, the question is, does revolution have to come in a violent form? I think the answer is no, it does not. Right. And I think that a violent revolution in Cambodia would be extremely dangerous. However, revolution in terms of protests, in terms of objections, in terms of hitting the international press, in terms of making it known what problems are over there, are crucial. Now, there's a number of studies on how to go about doing that. Obviously, the classic is Gandhi's, Gandhi's approach. But
nonviolent,
correct.
Protest, yeah.
But I think people have to go back and to say, look, if you are going to eliminate political parties and you are going to eliminate a group of people who are seeking peaceful change, you are forcing what John Kennedy once said as violent change. And what he said, if you recall, was that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Right. And that's what has to happen. And if Hun Sen were wise on this, he would recognize that dissent and the ability of people to participate doesn't weaken a country, but it strengthens a country.
Right. But again, he doesn't seem to heed international calls to allow opposition to go back or return to participate in the political process, democratic process.
Correct.
He still prefers to run the country on a single political party.
Right.
So we just don't know. To many Cambodians in and outside of the country, they just don't know which way to go, besides appealing to the international community. The international community appears to me adopts a wait-and-see attitude. Okay, if anything happens, we'll decide what to do next. Okay, something like that.
Well, I think it's extremely important. There are a few things that can happen. Sam Rainsy is outside the country right now. He needs to step up his activity with the United States Congress. He needs to make a little more noise in terms of his willingness to speak out and to point out what problems are existing in Cambodia at this particular time. Yeah. There are a number of congressmen and senators who are beginning to take a view toward what's going on. They need to come out, and it needs to be publicized by the media, the mainstream media. And what has to happen, in my opinion, is some of these events, for example, the possibility of Sam Rainsy going back needs to be highly publicized. Right. If he does go back, that needs to be shown, because I think because of the threats that Hun Sen has made to Sam Rainsy about arresting somebody who is a legitimate political candidate, needs to be covered and needs to be shown and needs to be shamed. Right. Kem Sokha needs to be released from prison, from house arrest. He needs to be allowed to promote the politics of this, and there needs to be fair and free elections in Cambodia. Right.
One question from our listeners and viewer, whose name is Suan Panyasit. I don't know, he's from here or from overseas, asking, what are the power of EBA and GSP? Can it affect the government of Phnom Penh? Do they have any impact?
Yes, I think so. When we were doing the sugar issue, if you remember, you may not know this, but this is one of the issues. The EBA was designed to reduce tariffs. And what it did is it made the sale of sugar, for example, much cheaper. Because it made it much cheaper, what it did is it promoted development. Because it promoted development, it got outside investors who felt comfortable with the country. They would go in, they would invest, they would bring the sugar out, and it would help the entire country. Now, the question then becomes is if investors are afraid to go in, or if EBA says there is not a competitive advantage and investors are lost, that becomes an economic sanction.
Right.
And that then is a message to the government that they have to change their behavior in order to improve the standards
Right.
for both economic development and for the individuals in the country.
Thank you. Now, another question from one of our listeners and viewers. After the CPP dissolved the CNRP, the opposition party, the CNRP itself appeared to be breaking apart. Do you think this is a good approach, a good way to stay breaking like this?
Well,
how are you going to change the status quo in Cambodia?
Yeah, the problem is, there's sort of realpolitik here.
Right.
The realpolitik is that Hun Sen has banned the CNRP.
Yeah.
It has basically said anybody that belongs to that party. Well, ideology itself has a million different varieties, and people ally with one another in order to gain power. That's the purpose of political parties.
Yeah.
It's to gain power. It's to make changes and so forth.
Right.
My feeling is that the CNRP does represent and has represented, in my opinion, a viable alternative to the CPP. But the real test is not whether you have one political party that opposes the CPP,
right.
but whether you have free expression, free choice within the country itself. So all of these people that belong to the CNRP, whether inside Cambodia or outside the Cambodia, I think should form new parties, should voice their opinion,
right.
should take positions and so forth. Whether it's called CNRP or it's called anything else, I
right.
think is somewhat irrelevant, as long as I think the end goal is democratic participation in the government of
right.
Cambodia.
But do you think many parties are better than a single, more unified, united?
That's a very good question too, and a lot of political scientists debate that. But and because I'm looking at this as a lawyer,
right.
The real question is whether you have a two-party system that the United States essentially has, or you have a multi-party system, parliamentary party that many of the other countries. I think in some ways the parliamentary party in some ways works better than a two-party system. I think, for example, right now, if you compare it to the United States, where we have these extremes on the left and the right, and the moderates are frozen out, in a lot of countries you basically would have a party that does represent the center.
Yeah.
So I think it has to be tailored to the needs of the Cambodian people.
Right.
Legally, the Constitution itself protects multi-parties,
Yeah.
and so it seems to me that is legally that's
right.
open, assuming that the courts
Right.
don't discriminate
Right.
against the people who try to
Right.
carry that out.
Now, please share with our listeners and viewers your knowledge and experience from the international, law point of view. If the Cambodian people in Cambodia and the Cambodian people overseas, abroad, sue Hun Sen for crime against humanity and violation of human rights, can the international community bring Hun Sen to the international court?
Well,
ICC?
the short answer is it can be done, but it is not an easy process.
Right.
It's an extremely difficult process because it first starts with the attempt of taking again the local government, the local
right.
Local country, and it has to investigate those crimes. Do I believe that there is enough to go after Hun Sen for the crimes that he's committed with regard to, for example, Sokha, with regard to the strikers that occurred a few years ago, with regard to the threats, with regard to the imprisonment?
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. I believe there's a crime. There are crimes there, but again, it comes down to both the enforcement, first the laws and the enforcement. The International Criminal Court can investigate.
Yeah.
A country can essentially recommend an investigation. That, I think, would be an ideal situation. Any of the countries, virtually any of the countries, can recommend an investigation.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that some countries can step up to ask for that. But without doing that, there's still the question by the ICC of whether they would turn back to the local government to see if they themselves would initiate some type of investigation, prosecution of Hun Sen.
You mean depending on the local court?
Right,
To
but
initiate.
Correct. But where you have a captured, essentially a captive port, it's unlikely to occur. So I do think that has to happen outside of Cambodia.
Right. That's most likely what is going to happen. Otherwise, I don't think any court in Cambodia would prosecute Hun Sen.
No, I don't
Now,
think so either.
on my way here, this is the question kind of outside of this discussion a little bit. On my way to work, I was stuck more than 2 hours on the street because some roads are closed because of the DC shutdown.
Because of climate change.
Climate change, yes.
Right.
A lot of activists, young
Right.
and old, school students, and
Right.
everybody else. Okay, now this climate thing issue is not something new, and yet it takes a long time for anybody to realize and perhaps address the problem.
Correct.
Now it takes some younger generation, 16, 10, 12 years old, to come together, walk out of the classrooms. Today I heard that about 4 million students in 150 countries walked out of school classroom, and no punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Cambodia, do you think it will take younger generation to act because the older generation, because of their past experience, they said, "Oh, this is good enough. Life is okay for now," but the young are going to bear the impact of any negative, policies from the ruling party.
This is really my opinion on this. I have 4 grandchildren. I have a couple of godchildren,
Right,
so
right.
I watch them quite a bit. And one of the things that I've noticed, one of the hopes that I always had was that with the spread of the internet and information, that people would read more, that they would have more information available, and they would have greater knowledge.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think some of the social media has actually created silos where people are more isolated in terms of their information. For example, some people do nothing but watch Fox News. Some people just watch the left news. Some people just watch the rightist news,
Right.
and so forth. Unfortunately, information can be controlled, and a lot of times is controlled by the government.
Yeah.
So the free flow of information, which is also, by the way, freedom of speech, is something that's a protected right under the internet, the international human rights. The question is, will the younger people simply go along with that over a period of time? Sometimes it takes the older generation, and it takes the reading of history to understand the perspective.
Right.
So what I would say is, I think that if the younger people knew and had information and had fair education with the history, essentially it would occur. That's what's happened in the United States with climate change. People have had the information. But you take a closed country, for example, North Korea. Take North Korea, or you take even Hun Sen in terms of limiting the ability of news to penetrate. The only information they have is that which is in front of them, and consequently the only way they can make a decision is based on the information they have. So it's essential that news and information and history penetrate the borders of every single country in the world in order to promote
Cambodia. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Mark Morstein, final words. Any message to the Cambodian people who yearn for democracy and respect for human rights?
There was a politician in the United States who said Donald Trump is the stress test for democracy.
Okay.
I thought it was a great metaphor in terms of
Okay.
And I think that runs with virtually every country, and I think it's very true with Cambodia. Cambodia has an excellent constitution. It has some very good laws.
Yeah.
But the enforcement and the pursuit and the administration of those laws couldn't be worse.
Okay.
And as a result of that, I think what's going on is there's a stress test for Cambodia as well. And I think we'll see if the people of Cambodia can overcome the limitations that Hun Sen has placed on the country.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark Morstein.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Very knowledgeable on Cambodia, and we thank you for sharing with us,
thank you
our
for having
viewers,
me today.
listeners,
Thank you.
your experience and knowledge. And we hope you'll come back again at some point.